We've got some great information on managing the entire system when transitioning to soil health practices. So we recognize it's not just about soils, it's about the whole system. So that's what we're doing today. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Abbey Wick, NDSU Extension Soil Health Specialist, and joined by
Angie Johnson. I also work for NDSU Extension as the Steele County agent based in Findlay, but I'm also the NDSU Extension Farm and Ranch Safety Coordinator as well. And so in addition about this whole systems management that Abby's was referring to today, we're also going to be having our Tech Talk portion on farm and ranch safety, because honestly, we're here for you. We care about you and your family and those that are working on your farm. And so we're going to have a really great opportunity to take some time and focus on safety today. With that, we have lined up an awesome panel today. So let's go ahead, meet them, dive right into our conversation on looking at the holistic approach when it comes to reduced tillage systems. And so first off, I want to introduce and ask you to introduce yourself. We have Jason. Jason, good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself for us?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me here. Jason Hanson. You see me on Twitter as Rock and Roll Agronomy, crop consultant, business consultant up in the Devil's Lake area, reside, little town of Webster, work primarily with farmers and some ag retailers. And just as a consultant, I'm interested in this not only as a participant, but as a person to help people transition, because there are some things that people have questions on, primarily being in the Devil's Lake Basin. It seems like we're kind of at the end of our wet cycle, and moisture was not a concern. The last 2 summers have been dry. So there's more interest in, if not going no-till, more direct seeding. And I definitely had more cover crops.
Thank you so much, Jason. We're excited to have you on. And also on our panel this afternoon, we have Audrey. Audrey, could you please introduce yourself to our group today?
Hi, everyone. So I'm Audrey Kalil. I'm a plant pathologist at the NDSU Williston Research Extension Center. I've been here since 2015. So the goals of my program are to improve disease management in the crops we grow here up in the Northwest. So it's a lot of pulse crops, chickpeas, peas, lentils, as well as durum wheat. So I do a fair amount of Fusarium head blight fungicide work on durum. I'm also currently leading the North Central IPM Center Pulse Crop Working Group, and we are the group that's currently producing the Growing Pulse Crops podcast series.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for sharing that information. And last but certainly not least on our panel this afternoon, we have Joe.
Joe Eckley, Extension Weed Specialist, based on campus here in Fargo for a couple of years now. But I know one of the fun things when talking about no-till and no-till weed challenges is my journey has taken me from the state of Maryland, where I grew up, through Indiana up to here. So plenty of no-till weed issues that are actually prevalent across the country and very similar here in North Dakota as my other stops in life. So excited to talk about some of the issues that we can hopefully overcome with controlling our weeds.
You know, I've got to ask this question first to Jason, since you're with Rock and Roll Agronomy. How did we do with our music today? Were we spot on?
You did well. Yes, that was good.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to keep some questions for you. But you know, you mentioned helping farmers transition to soil health practices on their farms and reducing tillage, using cover crops, using rotations. What are some of the things that you want farmers to keep in mind as they make this transition, whether it's specific to Devil's Lake, but any system in general?
I think the biggest thing is you've got to realize this is going to take some time to make that transition. If you've been in anything conventional farming, if it involves, we do a lot of fall tillage, and that has kind of been reduced. There's more direct seeding. And then my concern there is somewhat stratification of nutrients and how that impacts when you change systems, you somewhat change fertility. We probably aren't going to change our rotation too much, but machinery will change. And that's another thing. People found out real quick that direct seeding, even in a 1 or a 2 year situation, you have to have everything set up right, or immediately right off the bat, it just doesn't turn out the way you do. So everybody likes a quick fix. It's not that. And so I think that's another reason for these talks is the connections with people, because you can bounce ideas and people that have tried it. And that's what I try to tell my people. And they just use me as the resource, because then I become that person that collects that information for them.
Nice. So you mentioned about, equipment settings and things like that. Are you having growers, check their equipment settings per field, or, as conditions change, or what's kind of a gauge for how often they should be checking their equipment?
Well, we had, this year again, we had a lot of soybean stubble that was not worked. And so, and that was primarily because it was so dry. There was some barley ground that got worked, and then we lost pretty decent soil moisture from barley even to wheat harvest. And then as it got later, even more so. So we have a lot of stubble in those scenarios. So there'll be people that are going to just think that from last year, they can just go into that. They might hit it with a Selford, and that's it for secondary tillage. You can't do that. Whatever your disc openers might look sharp, that you're probably going to have to get new ones, because it is not going to take very long. It's such a big difference to have a lot of residue to go into versus if you're doing any amount of tillage. And really a Selford or a Joker or things like that, for the most part, are more field prep and not tillage, in my opinion. So you're going to be going through more residue, and you're going to wear stuff out a lot quicker. So for my guys that are going to do that this year, I've already talked to them that this is something you absolutely have to consider. And I know it's not cheap, but nothing is worse than starting out the season with a poor stand, no matter the crop. And we just can't do that.
One key thing that really stuck out for me is what you said is we're looking for that quick fix, right? We're looking for something fast. And so, Joe, I'm going to go right to you now, because we want that silver bullet when it comes to our weed management. And so we know how important it is, but in your experience with working with no-till during your time in Maryland, like you mentioned, and now moving up to the north, what are some key points that we need to remember when developing our weed management programs for these systems?
Key point number one is there are no silver bullets. So that's key point number one for weed control.
Oh, you got a big thumbs up from Jason.
I talked with Jason about, I've got a podcast now with some of my fellow weed scientists, and that's one of our taglines is silver bullets are for werewolves. They're not for weeds. You're not going to have a silver bullet for weed control. Number two is we can get pretty darn close for a while, even as we transition into no-till, because glyphosate is going to control a lot of our weeds out there. And one of the things that we tend to see when we shift into no-till production is a different weed spectrum. So we shift over to a lot of winter annual weeds. And a lot of these tend to be what I just kind of call junk weeds. They're out there, we see them. Oftentimes they're curious for ID purposes. And they're going to be mainly in the Asteraceae or the sunflower family and the mustard family. It's just going to be a lot of these weeds, a couple hundred different species that may germinate, but we can actually still control with glyphosate. It's some of the other ones that tend to stick out and be problematic that really drive some of the questions in no-till. And one of the first ones that we think about early season weed, mare's tail or horseweed. And so I chose this picture for my background for that reason. Is there is a bunch of little water have been there, but there's some bigger mare's tail or horseweed plants hiding behind me. And that's one of the weeds that's glyphosate resistant. For the most part, almost every time you run into it, it'll be glyphosate resistant. And it is quite, and it's quite prevalent across the entire United States. So you're going to see a shift in weed species, and glyphosate won't always work as your burn down. Primarily what we can do in future years is for these winter annual weeds, a fall burn down application tends to be a better choice for these winter annual weeds because they germinate in the fall and they're tough to control in the spring. However, that being the case, if this is your first year transitioning, you may have mare's tail lurking out there, didn't get anything applied in the fall. It becomes more challenging in the spring and really is more of a difficult situation, and we may be limited to the crops we can plant if we want an effective burn down of something like horseweed, if we have that in some of our fields.
I think, Audrey, I know you've done some work with diversity and crop rotations and management for disease pressures and those, using rotation. And so what are some of those things that you've learned, or, specifics, on how that helps manage disease?
If you're familiar with Northwest North Dakota, you're where we don't get a lot of rainfall. And so disease is really sporadic. And so maybe in a given year, you won't have a lot of disease. So you really need to think about your disease management in a long-term strategy. And I think that works in whatever environment you're growing in. And rotation is your long-term management plan. Some pathogens, some disease systems, we don't have good tools in. An example would be Aphanomyces root rot in peas and lentils. We're seeing that more and more here in the Northwest, and there really aren't good management strategies for that. So the key is prevention. And so long rotations between peas and lentils is the only way to keep being a pea and lentil producer long term. And you could say the same thing for other soil-borne diseases. In terms of foliar disease, rotation is really important to allow time for those pathogens to die, and no-till they're left on the surface. And so that helps actually, and sometimes they're exposed to the conditions that helps them become non-viable sooner. But the rotation will give that time to happen. So if you're continuously growing a crop, you're never giving time for those pathogens to go away. And that puts a lot of pressure on resistance. It puts a lot of pressure on fungicides, and both of those things can be overcome. And we want to keep as many tools in the toolbox as we can. And so rotation is really critical for that.
You mentioned foliar and then soil-borne diseases. And so when you're obviously in a primarily no-till system out there, but how do those things change, or those dynamics change with diseases as you transition to something like reduced till?
So generally speaking, people become more concerned with those residue-borne diseases if you're leaving crop stubble on the surface. In some cases, like I mentioned, that can actually be beneficial. Burying it in the soil can actually protect it, which you don't want. And sometimes if you bury it while you till again, and all of a sudden it's at the surface and it's still alive, instead of being left at the surface to die, like for example, a white mold sclerotia. So what we do think about those the residue-borne diseases, like for example, tan spot in wheat, Ascochyta blight in chickpea, and that's where rotation is really key.
Jason, I'm going to ask you this. We really can't forget about those insects, right? And so when cover crops or reduced tillage are part of that system, does that change pest dynamics in the system, or what do we need to consider when it comes to insect pests?
Well, yeah, I mean, that can happen. It'll depend. If your rotation stays the same, you probably won't see too big a differences there. But in my case, I had a more preventive plant this year, and probably the crop that was used the most in preventive plant was turnip and radish. So I also have a lot of canola in my area. So my concern there was, now I've got another host field for flea beetles, particularly because of the planting is later in the season. And one, it can take flea beetles away from my canola crop, but two, now they are moving into other areas where potentially I might not have had a problem, that next year I could have a problem. We're also drying out a little bit, and I don't know if on my fields are going to see more grasshopper pressure. I've got some hot spots in my area where I consult. Most of that's probably from the ditches, and I don't think that'll change too much. But you're always on that. Once you change something within your system, you always have to be watch out, because all this whole agriculture thing we play in here is give and take. So if we do something, something's going to change. So it's always something to watch out for. Those are two that I don't really have to deal with seed weevil and sunflowers, because sunflowers have moved out of my area because of rainfall in the past. Maybe sunflowers will come back in, but right now I kind of take it year to year. But if there's a transition to another system, you definitely got to pay more attention.
We've had some issues with grasshoppers and crickets eating our cover crop seed that we've flown on into corn. And Jason, I don't know if there's a solution to that. You certainly don't want to add another insecticide pass, but what is direct seed, getting that seed in the ground better for that situation, or what can we do there?
Yeah, it's interesting with certain insects and how they can, do what they do. I've had, my biggest problem is definitely flea beetles. And it is, so we have an insecticide on the seed, and the pressure is, you can just about time it to Memorial Day when things get really ramped up in their feeding activity, air temperature in particular. And we've had to do more spraying. And it doesn't seem in my direct seeding or my conventional that I've had any shifts yet. Now, I'm not really a no-till area. It's more direct seed, but I have quite a bit of canola. So it doesn't take much to mask that. And I'm not seeing a big difference within systems. It has more to do with where these crops are placed next to other fields in that. So I try not to use insecticides if I can. And really my other crops, I don't. It's very seasonal with soybeans. Mostly there it's aphids. I've had some borders this year with grasshoppers, but flea beetles have taken years off my life. I hate them, little insects.
Oh no.
So Joe, this one I'm going to guide towards you. And what options do we have for pre-emergent herbicide control for mare's tail in a row crop rotation, especially when moisture is one of our most limiting factors?
Yeah, so one of the things to really consider with the mare's tail is, as I mentioned, it's a primarily fall emerging weed, and it's going to overwinter and start bolting in the spring. But we do have some spring emerging populations. So we want to make sure we get our vernacular right here when we talk about a pre-emergence herbicide for mare's tail in a no-till system, because there's going to be the plants that are out there that you're trying to control before you plant, and we have a number of different options to get that done, including in row crops and small grains. But there's also going to be some plants that will emerge throughout the spring and summer as we do get some rainfall shots. So as far as what we can do in the spring ahead of many row crops, including small grains, those row crops which we can apply sharpen in front of, and that's many of our row crops, including small grains, chickpeas, field peas. When we can apply sharpen with glyphosate, and we also need to make sure the adjuvants get right for sharpen, so AMS and MSO, that's one of the better treatments that we have for burning down mare's tail in the spring. If you want some sort of residual activity out of sharpen, we need to go at least 2 ounces to start getting some residual activity for some of those plants that may emerge after that application. 1 ounce of sharpen simply doesn't give us a lot of residual activity if we have spring emerging populations to deal with. Some other products that we can use, gramoxone is a pretty good product that we can use ahead of any crop. It does benefit from the addition of metribuzin, so that does kind of limit us to our broadleaf crops, and then also from the addition of a group 4 herbicide such as 2,4-D or dicamba. So again, that may limit us even further onto what crops we can plant, but it simply helps gramoxone work a little bit better on mare's tail. And then the other product that's out there, relatively new, I say relatively, it's probably 5 or 6 years on the market now, is Elevore from Corteva. And so this is a product that was really brought to the market for mare's tail, if we look at the weed profile and how it fits globally. And so this, again, we can apply in front of many of our crops. We can actually apply it in crop for small grains, usually as a premix QLEX. But Elevore by itself, we can use in a burn down situation. We do have for some of our crops, such as soybean, sunflower, and canola, a 14-day waiting period from application till planting, but another pretty good option for mare's tail. Now, again, those are basically our foliar applied to take out the mare's tail that is there. If you do have spring emerging populations, the best products we can do in broadleaf crops would be the sulfentrazone, so Spartan products, or metribuzin. If you're dry, yes, we're going to have difficulty activating those products, but they're also relatively UV stable. So there's a good chance that they're going to sit there on the soil surface until we do get a rainfall for activation. The good news with many of our weed seeds, including mare's tail, is they will sit there on the soil surface until they get rainfall for activation. So because those products are relatively UV stable, we can get them on pre-emergence for residual activity and still get a benefit out of them in crop as well.
There's another question that came in that I deal with our growers is that when we have that high residue cover, should we be concerned when trying to use a pre-emerge herbicide with our no-till system when we have that excess residue or just high levels of residue?
Going to really depend on the level of residue and the type of residue and the product in question. So again, you asked about silver bullets. Well, I'm not going to answer anything with a one size fits all, even if it's herbicides in high residue environments. And so typically when we think about herbicides getting bound up in residue, we're talking about green residue. So if you have a living cover crop, for instance, we know we can get herbicide loss into that green tissue that way. If we're talking about dead plant tissue, dead residue from last fall's crop or last year's crop, we can get some herbicides tied up in that residue. For the most part, as the residue breaks down or as we get rainfall events, that will be released from the residue and make its way into the soil profile. It's some of our water-insoluble herbicides that can be more effective than others when it comes to being tied up even in dead plant residue. One I like to pick on a little bit is Zidua. It's a very good group 15 herbicide that we have to use, but that's one that tends to get tied up in these residues a little bit more frequently than the other ones like Dual or Outlook. So water-soluble herbicides, not so much. And the other thing, when we look at it practically, all the research that has been conducted is, yes, we can get some tied up in residue, but if you look at efficacy or control of our weeds in a high residue environment plus herbicide versus a no residue environment plus herbicide, they tend to be pretty comparable. So there are some products that can get a little bit tied up, but for the most part, you're going to get a lot more benefit by applying that herbicide into these situations.
Great. Well, I'm gonna go back to Audrey because there's a question that I have. We heard Jason talk about the flea beetle transfer from things like radish and turnip over to other cash crops. And so, we also know that radish and turnip can be a host for clubroot and then transfer that over to canola. Are there other disease transfer issues that we need to worry about between cover crops, the common cover crops and cash crops?
So a couple things come to mind. I think we had some questions last spring about, wheat that might have volunteered or durum that might have volunteered and letting that act as a cover crop and, then planting spring wheat or durum the following year. And, I've been seeing more and more wheat streak mosaic virus in our area. And this past summer, there were a couple fields where it was very severe and, the whole field was essentially stunted and yellow. And so I think that's a really high risk scenario. Maybe you can terminate that really early and allow that 2-week dead period. But there's always the chance that the mites can move to something else green in the meantime, and then go back into your spring wheat or your durum crop and cause problems for you. So I would be really hesitant to do that if you're a spring wheat or durum producer. That can be a really big problem. Second thing that comes to mind, and I haven't had personal experience with this, but it's been documented recently in a few publications out of Iowa, is issues with root rot diseases from the cereal rye going into corn. So when you terminate the cereal rye, the pathogens that attack that plant can increase in that time frame. And then as time goes on, eventually other microbes that like to eat decaying plant tissue will move in, and it's less of a situation where there's a bunch of pathogen and more of a situation where it's just, a general group of microbes that can eat decaying plant tissue. So, cereal rye and corn are both grasses. So there's the opportunity for some crossover of root pathogens from the roots of the cereal rye to the corn. And that's been documented in some publications where if you're planting too soon after terminating the rye, you can get some issues with root disease in the corn. And so that has been documented in some publications. And that's primarily from Pythium.
We talk often about no rye before corn, and I always say, well, the diseases can transfer, but now I know some of the details. Thank you, Audrey, for that. I appreciate it.
Jason, this question was brought up in the Q&A portion, going back to when you talked about how you really have to look at how you're changing your equipment. And so one of the questions was, do you have customers that are going back to hoe type drills versus disc openers to manage that increased residue on the fields?
I don't as of yet. And I think part of that is it's kind of what you're used to. I mean, there's a percentage of farmers, I think, that will make a change, and then they'll change a little bit of that equipment they use. But it's kind of almost like when you're used to something, you kind of stick with it, and then you kind of use other pieces of equipment to adjust around that. So I don't have any growers that use hoe drill openers. It's all single disc for the most part. I have one guy that uses a case, so it's a little more wider spread that he distributes it. But they're using shallow vertical tillage to manage around that instead of going to a hoe drill. So if I hear hoe drill, it's predominantly more central and western part of the state. So right here, I don't. We'll see what this year transitions into as far as our moisture content. And I don't think my guys will transition. It's like once you're used to an iPhone, you're probably not going to get off an iPhone. That's just my experience. So.
Yeah, I do have a follow-up question for Jason, though, on that. With, you mentioned using some vertical tillage and other tools like that to help manage or prepare the field in the spring. And you hear, ideas or concepts out there that maybe that's causing a compaction layer at some point in that soil. And are you seeing any of that with your growers? Or are you finding that tool is being used at a really good time to avoid that from happening?
It's very noticeable that ever since those tools have been used, and they're used because you can cover a lot of acres very quickly. It can get that field prepped. It dries it out just enough. You leave residue, and you're in there and you're seeding. But one thing you do notice, or I have noticed, is that yes, your ground is a lot firmer, and in some cases it's pretty hard since that. Also notice that when that tillage is gone, a couple weeds that I've dealt with now and gotten more calls on: foxtail barley, dandelion, horseweed, your winter annuals like pennycress are suddenly there in the spring very early. And so we're not doing anything to them except bending them over and they rebound. So there is, I will say that I've noticed quite a bit of it. And in some cases, depending on the year, it is not what we're looking for. So, but there's one of them trade-offs again. And guys are doing it because they don't want to go out there with 4-inch sweeps or, chisel points, beaver tails, and rip stuff up and dry it out. So that's what they're doing. So at some point, they're probably going to have to change back, and just a never-ending process, I guess.
Well, that's job security for you, right, Jason? You can constantly work with these shifting systems and managing them, and that gets right back at Joe's no silver bullet, right? There's nothing that you can do that isn't going to cause something else to react in a different way. But Joe, I want to ask you another question about it, and this is my question, so I'm going to take responsibility for this. Because I know you're going to tell me there's no silver bullet and you're not going to make a general recommendation, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Are there things that you know about herbicide residual and cover crops that could be generalized to not affect some of those cover crops that you're going to seed? Or are there certain cover crops that are a little bit more resilient to some of those residuals that you could actually grow?
Yeah, and so we can generalize a thing or two. So when we talk about herbicide persistence and interfering with cover crop establishment, the chemistry of the herbicide is largely going to drive any potential issues. And one is the half-life of that herbicide, or the amount of time it takes for 50% of that product to go away. Generally, a longer half-life, more problems with establishing something like a cover crop in the fall. Can somewhat further generalize as well that we do have some cover crop species that are just more highly susceptible to some of our herbicides we'll apply in crop. On top of my mind are the mustard species and turnips, and things like Flex Star that we can use in soybean, or some of our group 2 herbicides such as Pursuit or Raptor. Very sensitive to those type of chemistries. And so if you're trying to apply or to establish some mustards after a Raptor application or Pursuit application, you're going to have some difficulties. So I guess another way to really generalize it is if you're dealing with a cover crop that's very related to a crop that you're working with, and you can't apply that herbicide in that crop, you're likely to ding up that cover crop as well. So we know Flex Star and Pursuit, high rotation intervals to canola. Well, some of our brassica cover crops close enough that we can expect some injury. And it really is. It's like when we talk about controlling weeds, we can have certain weeds that are more sensitive or more tolerant to a single active ingredient of a herbicide. Well, cover crops are plants as well. And so it's hard to just fit everything under one umbrella. And that's why we'll do this research on applying different modes of action of herbicides, and then it's trying to establish different cover crop species following this herbicide applications in the fall. And so we do have a couple years of these data compiled, and in the weed guide this year, page numbers have shifted around a little bit, but pages 105 and 106 in this year's weed guide have some of our typical herbicides we might use in small grains or in soybean, and some relative risk levels as far as injury if we're trying to establish cover crops following the use of those products.
So I'm going to bounce back to Audrey. We had a question in our chat that asked about, is there any research out there on how far a rye plant needs to be from corn before it no longer impacts the corn?
Sure. So what I was talking about earlier, I guess you would have to assume that the corn is being planted in where the rye plant was, where the rye plant roots were. You know, I'm guessing this is a scenario where you have control over where the plant is going to grow, maybe a precision planting scenario. You know, the Pythium is the organism that we're concerned about. It's in the soil. And if it's growing a lot on these dying rye roots, there is a little bit of potential for it to move around. That is the biggest issue if you have a wet soil. So Pythium is an oomycete, that's a water mold, and it can produce swimming spores. So there is a little bit of mobility there, even though it's in the soil. So, you know, I don't know how carefully you can place this seed, but I'm not sure you're going to be able to avoid the negative effects of the increasing root disease pressure from the dying rye plants. They found that just waiting long enough for the plant to really decay and for the microbial population to be less dominated by the pathogen and more dominated by just general soil microbes that feed on those dying plants. So in this case, it's a time issue and not a seed placement issue.
Maybe that's why they say terminate at 14 days in advance. I mean, would that be enough time to get that tissue to decay or to, you know, be dead and decaying enough? Or maybe that's for competition that they recommend 14 days.
Right. So I'm trying to remember the exact dates offhand in this publication. The dates that stick out is that it was 10 days or less that they observed the issue in, and then even 1 day after planting, they observed an issue there. So the other timeframes they were looking at, I know one was like a 17-day and a 21-day. So yeah, kind of in that 2-week time frame was the later time points where they observed less of an issue.
Oh, good. Well, thank you for that. Again, I learn every time we do these soil talks and talking with my colleagues. So really, I mean, the end point is don't put your rye in front of your corn to make sure you avoid that scenario entirely. But if you do have rye out there and you're planting corn, to make sure that you terminate it in advance so that you avoid yield loss and disease pressures. So thank you for that. I'm trying to think, we're looking for more questions for the Q&A, please. So anyone that's got some questions, please put those in there so we can ask them. Otherwise, Angie and I will continue to fire away. But maybe we'll go back to Jason, and this is kind of just a general question on, you know, in your opinion, we're able to reduce weed, disease, and pest pressures by using soil health practices, or are we really just, and you've kind of alluded to this, we're just shifting our pressures. So, you know, we hear a lot about, you know, soil health is the silver bullet for your systems, and it will reduce all those pressures. And is that anything that you're seeing, or is that a possibility?
Well, I think there'll be a couple things that come into play. Of course, you kind of have the market to deal with. And there's certain crops that are more profitable on your farm. I think the biggest thing in my area is still dealing with salinity and trying to make acres that you farm more productive, or to be able to do something than to remain unproductive. It'll be very interesting going forward as what the new administration in Washington, D.C. will come out with their ag policy, because I think that's going to have some impact as well. And then this whole discussion might become even more ramped up. Again, for me, it's that transition, or I have guys that if they'll do something, are going to start on a couple fields and try it. They're not going to do the whole thing. And we have to adjust our weed management. We have to adjust some fertility and some of the things already with their equipment. But for the most part, the change is, it's right here. That's the biggest place it starts. So, you know, I'm probably not the best resource when it comes to machinery. It's just kind of what I see. But I mean, this forum, social media, that's where the place to go to find it, because you'll run across, if you ask enough questions, and find those people to have deeper discussions. But it's the hottest trend right now, I think, or the most talked about. And there are concerns as far as erosion and sustainability, whatever that means, depending on where you're from. But for me, it's just trying to do the right thing for my farmers as they see what they need to do. And there's, most of it's external, but
most of what's happening is here, you know, in soil health, and it's a change in mindset. It's a change in, you know, your approach and how you're doing things and your reasons for doing things. It's really kind of discovering what your goals are and how these practices can fit together to achieve those goals. We have about 10 minutes left for this panel, and we want to make sure that we give you an opportunity to say things that we maybe have not asked you. So let's go around and maybe start with Audrey. Is there anything that we missed that you wanted to bring up or mention about disease pressures in soil health systems?
Yeah, so I think something we hadn't touched on yet was intercropping. I think there's been a lot of questions in that arena. There's actually quite a lot of literature out there looking at intercropping. I guess if you're going to make a general statement about it, benefits are going to depend on your intercropping partners. Some partners work and some partners won't for some diseases and not others, but there is a large body of research out there showing that there are some disease management benefits. Some of that has to do with the other crop acting as a barrier. So the pathogen has a harder time moving around the field. And some of them has to do with just decreasing the pathogen density. And sometimes below ground, there can actually be root interactions. In one case, looking at the soybean root disease. So there's a lot of interesting things happening there. I think there are possibilities. You just have to know which partners to choose.
And so what are some of those partners? You know, I'm curious about intercropping, and I always am. When you're growing two crops at once, what that looks like. What are some of those partners that work, you know, partner crops that work really well together?
Seems like what people are doing out here are your legumes and your oil seeds, and then chickpea flax or lentil flax. So that's what we've been seeing the most of. You know, and there have been some documented cases where foliar disease, so that'd be ascochyta blight and chickpea, is reduced in intercropping systems. I would say don't throw out your fungicide yet. That crop is very susceptible to ascochyta blight, and there's still, when disease pressure is high, which in this case is most of the time, that fungicide still provides a benefit, but you're putting less pressure on that fungicide product. In the case of the lentil flax, you know, one of the benefits with that, even if you're not getting disease control. So I had one person this summer that was growing a lentil flax mixture, and I did find a Phantomyces in his field. So that's a root rot pathogen, and it was quite severe. But what he noticed is that where the lentil was dying off, he was getting more flax. And so it was kind of an insurance mechanism there, where if you do have a pressure in your field and it does result in plant death, maybe there's an opportunity for whatever is the other crop to kind of take over in that area of the field. There's a recent review on oil seeds and pulses. I'll put that on my Twitter account so people can take a look at it. It's a pretty interesting system, and I think there's going to be people interested in adopting that moving forward.
We have one more question that came up for you, and it's a pretty general one on, can you test for these soil-borne pathogens?
Unfortunately, we don't have as many resources here in the US as they do in other countries. Obviously, one soil-borne, nematode, so I guess parasite, would be the soybean cyst nematode. So that's something you can definitely test for. In Canada, there are resources to test for, you know, Aphanomyces, fusarium, pythium. Australia has a really nice soil testing system that's been commercialized, and they've been able to link some of that to agronomic outcomes in wheat, for example, and have some recommendations. This is actually something that working on a Especially Crop Research Initiative grant to get those resources more close to home. But they do exist. You might have to search a little bit in the US, unfortunately.
Thank you, Audrey. Appreciate it. Should we go to Joe for his final thoughts on anything we missed?
I'm just going to kind of go back to what Jason said. Some of these shifts are up here. And the way I'll put that in perspective is, as I mentioned, I'm from Maryland. Horseweed or mare's tail is still one of the most problematic weeds in that state. And that's because it can be difficult to shift your mindset to applying herbicides at multiple times of the year when you don't have a crop out there. Fall burn down applications for some of these problematic weeds in no-till are some of the most effective and cheapest applications we can make. But also it's the fall. We want to harvest our crops and be done with the year a lot of times. But if you're in a no-till production system, that's often when weed control starts for the next year, is once the crop is out of the way and there's green things growing in the field. So it's going to take a mindset shift. And whether you use cover crops or not, you just have to kind of reset some expectations. One with cereal rye as a cover crop tool for weed control will control the weeds. And the answer is always maybe. And that's going to depend oftentimes on what weeds you're dealing with. Early season emerging weeds are ones that try to live at the same time as rye, like mare's tail, or early season emerging kochia, we can get some benefit from rye. But weeds can also adapt to germinate later in the season once we've lost the weed control benefits of rye. And so it's kind of something to work into a system. We're not going to replace anything or use any silver bullets. And I'm just going to address one thing here in the chat box that Adam S., I'm guessing that's Spellhog, put in there, as about intercropping corn and extend soybeans. And yes, Adam, there is no legal way to spray dicamba in that type of system in 2021. So we've kind of gotten over the honeymoon phase of getting dicamba labels back for use and extend, but now we're digesting the labels a little bit more fully. And if you want to use an approved dicamba product and extend soybeans, it can only be used on extend soybeans. And if you want to use a dicamba product that you can use in corn, you can't legally use that on extend soybeans now. So that is one of these things moving forward that we could have done that last year, but due to label changes, that is no longer legal moving forward.
Jason, do you have any comments that you'd like to share with our group today?
I'll just say this, that we talk about a lot of these things, and let's not forget that one of the things we're doing right now is we have a pretty good sized group that's on here listening, and we're using Zoom. So that's the technology platform. Just a couple things I picked up. I'm going to be checking out the Growing Pulse Crops podcast that Audrey talked about. I got my notes from Audrey about this Pythium with rye to corn. Of course, I will, thanks for reminding me, Joe, I will be listening to the War Against Weeds podcast as well. But I think that's the whole platform there. So whether it's this format or something else, is that we're getting together, sharing information, and trying to make everybody better, or at least be more profitable on some of these ventures.
Thank you for that. And thanks to all of our panel members, Audrey, Jason, Joe. We appreciate you taking the time to share your experience with us.
So we still have, let's call it the best for last, right? So our Tech Talk segment. And this week I am excited and honored. We are this is our promotion and forefront of our NDSU Extension Farm and Ranch Safety Program. And so we've got the awesome Scott Huso joining us this afternoon to talk about some of the amazing practices that he and his wife Elizabeth have really spearheaded and pushed forward when it comes to inclusion of safety first every single time, every single day on their farm. And so Scott, if you're on with us, would you please introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background of your operation?
Yeah, hi, I'm Scott Huso, and Angie had mentioned that this is something that Elizabeth and I work on. You'll see that I'm in the office and there's a chair here where Elizabeth was sitting. Got some nice duct tape on the top there. But Elizabeth is an EMT, and she got an ambulance call about a half an hour ago. So she had to take off, and she had worked hard on this presentation. These are her notes.
Oh, wow.
And so here I go. But anyway, yeah, I farm just southwest of Minetta. We raise a bunch of different crops, and safety is a key component on our farm. Mainly within the last few years, we've really focused on safety.
So as you and your wife take on farm safety on your own operation, what are some of the approaches that you've been using?
The reason we got started with the farm safety program we have is because we participate with the workforce safety and insurance. And so we pay a premium for this insurance policy that covers any of our employees if they were to get injured while working on the farm. And as a part of that program, employers can get a discount if they participate in some safety programs that are implemented by WSI. And so that's how we started our meetings. Basically, we chose a safety coordinator for our farm, and that's my wife. And so she's been very involved in picking different topics to talk about at our meetings. I'll just give you a kind of an idea of how it works. So the main goal on our farm is to prevent injuries. And so that's, I mean, everybody knows that that's the idea. Anything that we're doing on the farm, whether we're direct seeding or we're spraying or harvesting or doing some type of falls work, there is an opportunity to get injured. Any little thing you're doing, there's a chance that you can get injured while you're doing it. And so we've organized this program, our safety program, and Elizabeth coordinates it. We have meetings every morning when everybody shows up to the farm. We have meetings that go over what we're planning on doing for that particular day and what's coming up in the next week. On Monday mornings, my wife Elizabeth comes to our morning meeting, and she goes over safety discussion of what we're planning on doing that week. So, for example, in the spring when we're seeding, we will talk about, backing a truck up to a conveyor or an auger that's loading the tank on the drill. And so we'll actually take time to go over what hand signals and different things that we're using, so everybody's on the same page. There should be no confusion as to what hand signals we should use, and that would help prevent injury. And then we also talk about what seem like the simple things, but you don't really think about them until you're doing them. Like if you're changing the depth setting on your drill. So we've got a John Deere 1890 drill, and as you're crawling around the drill, there's different things that you can think of before you do that, so you don't create a hazard for yourself. And then similarly into the summer when we're more focused on spraying, and then when we get into fall, we talk about harvest and looking at grain bins and safety things we need to talk about when we're focusing on grain bins and grain hauling and different things like that.
So Scott, how is this? I mean, that picture was powerful. I mean, you had a whole group of employees right there. You showed your lockout tagout system. I mean, that's just huge. How hard was it for you to have that behavior change shift on your operation? I mean, were your employees hesitant, or we know all of everything, we don't need to do this, or were they really embraced by how much you and Elizabeth cared for them?
Well, Elizabeth's got three questions here, three big questions. Is employee buy-in difficult? Is it a struggle to keep employees active in that? And the answer is yes. It has been hard to get employee involvement, but we've seen that over time, when we try to have the safety meetings, I would say 4 or 5 years ago, our employees would just kind of be sitting there and listening to us talk about the safety stuff. But over the years, and Elizabeth's done a great job of getting them involved, they're actually very involved now. I mean, it took some time, but our employees are very involved. So when we have our monthly safety meeting, so for workforce safety and insurance, we have to have a monthly safety meeting that all of our employees signed that they attended. At that meeting, it's mostly our employees doing the talking about what, for example, what they're working on and what potential safety hazards would exist with whatever they're doing.
Now, you've implemented this now for a few years, and then COVID strikes. Did you have to make any adjustments to handle the COVID pandemic with how we handle and utilize equipment with the amount of employees you have on your farm?
We tried to distance ourselves a little bit. Right away, about a year ago when this all started, there was a lot of, information. We didn't really know how serious it was. So we just kept showing up to our morning meetings like no big deal. Well, then we realized how big of a issue COVID-19 is. So then we started showing up to the farm all wearing masks for 2 or 3 days. But we basically, it's hard to not be within 6 feet of other guys when we're, loading the drill or mixing chemical or dumping grain into an auger, going into a bin. So we try to maintain a little bit of distance, but it's been a little bit of an issue. We had a couple of employees that actually got COVID, but basically had no symptoms.
We've got a great group. Our audience has been awesome with participating. If you have producers out there that are like, gosh, I want to be innovative and really set the bar for not only my own family, but the employees that I have, Scott, how would you help them and recommend that they get started? Because like you had said, it's not an easy conversation to have. I mean, we kind of take safety for granted. We're superheroes, right? We can do anything and everything until that one time where we get caught, and that's when accidents can happen. So how would you recommend people really get started with this message of safety first so you can do the job you love every day?
I think that's a very good question, Angie. So we do have this safety program, and we put, we're proud that we do it, and we try to do everything right all the time. But just a little over 2 years ago, we had an employee that got caught in a drag auger in a grain bin, and he had very serious injury to his legs. He was able to keep both of his legs, but had very serious injury. And so that just goes to show, even though we think we have a great program, injuries can still happen, and they can happen just instantaneously. And that's what happened in this situation. But to any farmers that are thinking of implementing some type of a safety program, first of all, I would say you should consider working with Workforce and Safety Insurance, because that's an insurance policy that can help. If something were to happen on your farm, they can help cover any cost related to an employee getting injured. Secondly, like you said, Angie, we think we're immune to any injury because we know exactly what we're doing. That's not the case. And so, for example, if we're talking about truck driving, we actually talk about how we get into the truck and how we get out of the truck, because if I'm jumping out of a semi, I'll likely open the door and just jump out. Well, what I really should do is step on both steps as I'm going down while I'm holding the rails on the side of the door. And so it's just to think about the little things like that. And the third thing is to write things down. If you have employees that say something or give you an idea, it's a great thing to write it down, to keep in your file when you're looking at things moving forward.
You've really set the bar, and I love that we're finally getting this conversation going. We shouldn't be embarrassed or ashamed that we put our employees and our family first every day and every time.